The world at war had forged a new kind of battlefield, one unlike the grand charges of cavalry or the sweeping maneuvers of past empires. Across Europe, a line of mud, barbed wire, and misery stretched for hundreds of miles. This was the Western Front, where men lived and died in the trenches. The ground was scarred with shell craters, the air thick with smoke, and the silence broken only by the crack of rifles or the thunder of artillery. Soldiers found themselves in narrow ditches dug deep into the earth, walls reinforced with sandbags, wood, and mud. Ooh. These ditches were meant to shield them from machine guns and shrapnel, but they became prisons of endurance. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the war seemed endless. The conditions were brutal. Rain turned the trenches into rivers of muck, swallowing boots and dragging men into exhaustion. Rats swarmed in the thousands, feeding on scraps and even the fallen. Disease spread easily. Trench foot, lice, and infections thrived in the filth. For soldiers often stood ankle deep in mud, cold and wet, with little chance of relief. At night, the cries of the wounded lingered across no man's land, that deadly stretch of ground between opposing trenches. Combat was relentless. At dawn, whistles blew and men climbed over the top, charging into machine gun fire that cut down ranks within seconds. Artillery barrages shook the earth for hours before assaults, leaving the ground churned and lifeless. Poison gas drifted silently over the trenches, burning lungs and blinding eyes, adding another layer of terror to an already merciless war. Yet amid the horror, there were glimpses of humanity. Soldiers wrote letters home, clinging to the thought of loved ones. They shared food, stories, and songs to keep spirits alive. In rare moments, like the Christmas truce of 1914, men from both sides climbed out of the trenches to exchange greetings, play football, and recognize the shared struggle of survival. But such moments were brief, swallowed again by the grinding machine of war. Life in the trenches was not glory, but survival. It was the story of men caught in a war that seemed to have no end, where courage was measured not by victory, but by enduring another day under fire. The trenches stood as symbols of suffering and sacrifice where countless lives were spent for mere yards of ground. And though the war would one day end, the memory of those who endured that existence in mud and blood would never be forgotten. The unforgiving conditions of trench life were as much an enemy to the soldier as the opposing army. For many who fought in the First World War, the daily struggle was not only against bullets and shells, but also against the very ground beneath their feet. Trenches stretched for miles, dug deep into the soil, offering a measure of protection but creating an environment that slowly ate away at body and spirit. When rain fell, which it often did, trenches became rivers of filth. Water had no place to drain, so it pooled and turned the earth into thick, clinging mud. Men sank ankle deep, sometimes even waist deep, forced to wade through muck that pulled at their boots and made every movement an exhausting task. In winter, the mud froze solid, cutting skin and numbing limbs. In summer, the heat baked the walls of earth, but the stench of rot and waste became unbearable. The trench was never a place of comfort. It was a cage of survival. Rats thrived in this world of decay. Fat from feeding on corpses and leftover scraps, they swarmed in their thousands, bold and unafraid of men. Soldiers recalled lying awake at night as rats ran across their bodies, gnawed at their food, and even attacked the faces of the dead. Some men made a game of killing them, but there was no end to the infestation. The rats multiplied as quickly as the shells fell, reminding soldiers that the trenches were not theirs alone. Disease spread easily in such close, filthy quarters. One of the most dreaded conditions was trench foot caused by standing too long in wet boots. Feet would swell, turn numb, and develop open sores. In severe cases, gangrene set in, and amputation became the only option. Lice-infested clothing burrowing into seams and seams, causing constant itching. Soldiers would strip down and burn their clothes over flames to kill the pests, only to find themselves crawling with lice again within days. Dysentery and other stomach illnesses tore through the trenches as clean water was scarce and sanitation nearly impossible. The smell of latrines, mixed with gunpowder and rot, became a permanent part of life. The lack of sleep added to the suffering. Soldiers lived in a cycle of exhaustion, always on edge, never truly safe. At night, the cold bit hard, and without proper rest, men became shells of themselves. They relied on rum or tobacco to dull the senses, anything to distract from the misery around them. Letters from home provided some comfort, but often reminded them of what they had lost. warm beds, clean food, and the simple freedom of dry ground. Every trench had its own unique character, but misery was universal. Dugouts collapsed after heavy rain or shelling, burying men alive. Supplies were hard to move through the mud, so rations often arrived spoiled or late. The monotony of stale bread, tinned meat, and weak tea wore down morale almost as much as enemy fire. Even simple hygiene became a luxury. Shaving, washing, or changing socks was rare, and men lived for weeks in the same filthy uniforms. For the soldiers, the trench was both shield and tormentor. It kept them alive from the bullets of machine guns and the shrapnel of shells, but it drained their strength day by day. The ground became a reminder that survival was not measured in victories, but in enduring the mud, the rats, the disease, and the endless wait for an order that might send them over the top. The unforgiving conditions of trench life revealed a truth about the First World War, that it was not only a clash of armies, but also a battle of endurance against an environment that consumed men as surely as enemy fire. Every soldier who stepped into the trenches carried not just a rifle, but also the weight of mud, cold, and sickness. For many, this silent war against the conditions was as brutal and unforgiving as any fight on the battlefield. The deadly reality of no man's land was the most haunting aspect of trench warfare. It was a stretch of ground that lay between two opposing trench systems, often no more than a few hundred yards wide. Yet it was the most dangerous place on the Western Front. Covered in barbed wire, churned by constant shelling, and littered with the bodies of the fallen, it stood as a grim reminder of the cost of advancing even a few steps. To cross it was to gamble with death. Whenever the order came to a go over the top, soldiers knew what awaited them. At dawn, whistles blew and men scrambled up ladders, rifles in hand, clambering out of the relative safety of their trenches into the open killing fields. The moment they exposed themselves, enemy machine guns opened fire. The sound was deafening, long bursts cutting down entire lines of advancing troops. Men who had trained for months often lasted only seconds before being struck down. The survivors had to push forward through a storm of bullets and shells, struggling to find gaps in barbed wire that stretched across the field like a steel net. Many became trapped, caught on the wire, helpless targets for enemy fire. Artillery had already torn no man's land into a nightmarish landscape. Craters the size of small houses scarred the earth, filled with water, mud, and sometimes bodies. Poison gas drifted low, invisible at first, searing lungs and eyes. The ground itself seemed alive with danger. Every step risked sinking into mud that could swallow a man whole. The smell of smoke, decay, and chemicals clung to the air, choking any sense of calm. For those who were wounded in no man's land, the suffering was almost beyond imagination. Many fell where they stood, unable to crawl back to their trench. Cries for help echoed across the battlefield at night, but to attempt a rescue was nearly suicide. Stretcher bearers, some of the bravest men in the war, risked their lives to reach the injured, darting into the open under fire. Even so, countless men lay stranded between the lines, dying slowly, their voices fading into the chaos. The fear of no man's land lingered long before a soldier even stepped into it. Days in the trenches were filled with dread, knowing the next order could send them over. Soldiers tried to steel themselves by writing final letters home, tucking them into pockets in case their bodies were found later. The thought of being left exposed, unburied, gnawed at every man. Yet, despite its horrors, no man's land was not always silent death. In rare moments, patrols moved under cover of night, creeping through shell holes to gather intelligence or capture prisoners. These missions demanded absolute silence, every movement a risk of detection. The men who went out on such tasks described the eerie stillness of the battlefield, broken only by distant gunfire or the rustle of rats. To be caught in the open at dawn was to face certain death, so timing was everything. Symbolically, no man's land became more than a battlefield. It was a place where hope and despair collided. Each side threw men against it, pouring lives into a ground that never seemed to change hands. Gaining 100 yards could cost thousands of lives, and often the land was lost again in the next counterattack. It was a space that consumed human effort, swallowing courage and blood alike, leaving behind only wreckage and loss. To cross no man's land was not only a physical act, but a psychological trial. Soldiers lived with the knowledge that their turn would come, that one day they would have to rise from the trench and face the storm. The terror was universal, whether for a young recruit or a hardened veteran. It was a test of endurance, not only of body but of will, as men pushed themselves forward into what they knew could be their final moments. The deadly reality of no man's land defined the First World War. It was the stretch of earth where bravery met futility, where strategy often gave way to slaughter, and where countless men gave their lives for ground that seemed forever out of reach. Its scars remain, not only in the soil of Europe, but also in the memory of what it meant to fight in a war where survival was never guaranteed, and every step into the open was a step into death. The psychological toll of endless bombardment and the struggle for survival was one of the most invisible, yet devastating aspects of trench warfare. Unlike a bullet wound or a missing limb, the mental scars could not be seen, but they left men broken long after the guns fell silent. Fully. Soldiers lived in a state of constant tension, where each day in the trenches tested not only their endurance but also their sanity. The most dreaded sound was the thunder of artillery. Shells rained down at all hours, sometimes for days without pause. The sky would flash, the earth shook, and the trenches rattled like cages under siege. There was no escape from the sound. Men huddled low, covering their ears, waiting for the next blast. Every explosion brought the fear that the next shell would land directly on them. This endless anticipation, hour after hour, crushed the nerves. Soldiers described trembling uncontrollably, unable to sleep or think, their minds consumed by the thunder overhead. Some bombardments lasted so long that men began to lose track of time. Day and night blended into one continuous nightmare. They survived not by planning for the future, but by clinging to the hope of making it through the next minute. The constant fear became a weight, pressing on the chest, wearing down the will to fight. When the shelling finally stopped, silence felt even more terrifying. Every creak, every whistle of wind was mistaken for the start of another barrage. The strain of survival extended beyond the artillery. The sight of death was everywhere. Fallen comrades lay in no man's land, their bodies often unreachable, left to decay under the sun or rain. In the trenches, men lived beside the dead for days, unable to bury them during heavy fire. The stench of decay became part of the air they breathed, a constant reminder that death was only an arm's length away. Some soldiers tried to block it out, others grew numb, but for many, the images stayed burned into their minds forever. Sleep was rare, and when it came, it brought little relief. Men awoke shaking from nightmares, haunted by the faces of the fallen or the roar of guns. Fatigue made everything worse. Reaction time slowed, tempers flared, and despair deepened. Some soldiers muttered to themselves, unable to control their thoughts. Others collapsed into silence, staring blankly at nothing. What came to be known as a shell shock took hold. Trembling hands, loss of speech, uncontrollable panic. At the time, it was poorly understood, and some commanders dismissed it as cowardice. But it was the brain's response to unrelenting trauma. Letters from home offered a fragile lifeline, but they also cut deeply. Reading about families, wives, and children reminded men of everything they might never see again. Some clung to these letters, rereading them by candlelight, while others tore them up, unable to bear the weight of memory. Bonds between soldiers became just as important as letters from home. Sharing food, stories, or simply sitting in silence created a sense of brotherhood. These friendships gave men strength, yet they also carried pain, because at any moment, a friend might be lost in battle. The mind became a battlefield of its own. To endure, soldiers developed ways to harden themselves. Some joked darkly about death, some sang songs to drown out fear, and others shut themselves off emotionally. But no amount of resilience could erase the toll. When the war ended, many carried these scars home, unable to adjust to peace, haunted by flashes of memory that never faded. The psychological burden of trench life was a war within the war. It stripped men of their innocence, tested their limits, and left wounds deeper than shrapnel. Survival was not just about dodging bullets or shells, but about holding the mind together when the world around them crumbled. For countless soldiers, the battle did not end when the guns fell silent. It followed them, echoing in their minds long after the trenches were abandoned. The use of new and terrifying weapons such as poison gas and heavy artillery marked a turning point in the history of warfare during World War I. For centuries, battles had been fought with rifles, bayonets, and cavalry charges. Now, the industrial age brought machinery of destruction on a scale no one had ever imagined. The trenches turned into proving grounds for these inventions, and soldiers became unwilling subjects in a war driven by science and steel. Heavy artillery was the dominant weapon of the war. The giant guns could fire shells weighing hundreds of pounds over vast distances, reducing villages, forests, and entire landscapes into smoking rubble. Shellfire was relentless, and its destruction was absolute. An artillery barrage could last for days, softening up enemy positions before an infantry attack. Soldiers in the trenches described the ground shaking as if the world itself were breaking apart. The sky flashed day and night, the air filled with smoke, and the earth was torn open. Even if a shell didn't land directly on a man, the concussion alone could shatter eardrums, rupture organs, or leave him stunned and disoriented. This constant bombardment created what became known as the storm of steel, a phrase that captured the sheer brutality of the artillery's dominance. Unlike the clean wounds of a bullet, shells mangled bodies, leaving behind sights so horrific they haunted survivors forever. Entire units could be wiped out in an instant, buried alive when dugouts collapsed. Men lived in constant fear of the shrieking whistle that preceded a shell's impact, knowing they had only seconds to pray, dive, or freeze in terror. If artillery ruled the earth, poison gas ruled the air. First unleashed by the Germans at Ypres in 1915, clouds of chlorine gas drifted silently across no man's land, sinking into the trenches. Soldiers gasped for air as their lungs burned, coughing up foam and blood. Panic spread faster than the gas itself, as men scrambled to cover their faces with rags soaked in urine, the only defense before gas masks were introduced. Later, deadlier variations appeared: phosgene, which suffocated silently, and mustard gas, which caused blisters to erupt on skin and seared the eyes until men were blinded. Gas was not always lethal, but its cruelty was unmatched. Those who survived its effects were often scarred for life, their lungs permanently damaged, their skin blistered, their eyesight ruined. Worse still was the psychological torment it caused. The mere thought of a gas attack, especially at night or in fog, kept soldiers awake and trembling. Even the hiss of steam or the smell of chemicals could trigger blind panic as men imagined the invisible killer creeping toward them. The machine gun added yet another layer of terror. Capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, it turned open fields into killing zones. Any mass charge across no man's land was suicidal, as advancing soldiers were cut down in waves. The machine gun made old tactics obsolete, yet generals persisted in ordering frontal assaults, leading to catastrophic losses. For the soldiers, the weapon symbolized the futility of their struggle. Courage in numbers meant nothing against an enemy entrenched behind wire and steel, with machine guns sweeping every approach. Flamethrowers and tanks appeared later in the war, adding new horrors. The flamethrower spewed burning fuel into trenches and dugouts, incinerating everything it touched, while tanks rumbled across no man's land, crushing wire and striking fear into those unprepared for such armored beasts. Although primitive in their early forms, these weapons hinted at the future of mechanized warfare, where machines would dominate the battlefield. What made these weapons so terrifying was not just their physical destruction, but their psychological impact. Soldiers were no longer fighting men face to face with rifles and bayonets. They were fighting machines, gas, and unseen forces of destruction. Every sound, every smell, every vibration of the earth became a warning of death. War was no longer personal. It was industrial, cold, and merciless. The introduction of these weapons reshaped the nature of combat. They created a battlefield where courage alone was not enough to survive. Men huddled in the mud, caught between artillery that rained from above, gas that seeped through the air, and machine guns that cut them down in the open. These innovations made the First World War not just a conflict between nations, but a grim demonstration of how technology could turn battlefields into slaughterhouses. The war's weapons left scars not only on the land, but on the very idea of warfare itself. They showed that science could create tools of unimaginable destruction, and they redefined how soldiers fought, suffered, and died. In the trenches, men discovered that the enemy was not just across no man's land, it was the new age of war itself. Amid the mud, gunfire, and despair of trench life, moments of humanity and brotherhood stood out like small flickers of light in the darkness. Soldiers lived every day with the knowledge that death could come at any moment, yet within the walls of their trenches, they built bonds that helped them endure. For many, these bonds of friendship and fleeting moments of kindness were the only things that gave meaning to their suffering. The most personal lifeline was the letter. In the rare, quiet hours between bombardments, men would gather scraps of paper, write by candlelight, and pour their hearts into words for families waiting far away. Letters spoke of longing for home, of farms left behind, wives and children missed, or simple details of daily life in the mud. For the soldiers, writing was a way to remember they were still human, still connected to a world beyond the battlefield. Receiving a letter was even more precious. Men passed them around, reading aloud passages, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying. These moments reminded them that they were not forgotten, that their sacrifice had a purpose beyond the war. Songs and humor became weapons of survival. Soldiers sang in dugouts, their voices rising over the dull roar of artillery. Sometimes the songs were patriotic, but often they were playful, mocking the harshness of their conditions. Jokes and nicknames were shared constantly. Laughter, however brief, lifted spirits and pushed back despair. Even in the most hopeless circumstances, men found ways to laugh because laughter was rebellion against the misery around them. Food was scarce and often unappetizing, tinned meat, hard bread, and weak tea, but sharing rations was an act of trust and brotherhood. A soldier who received an extra portion of jam or chocolate might split it with a friend, knowing it could be their last sweet taste for weeks. Cigarettes became a kind of currency, but they were also tokens of kindness. Lighting a cigarette for a comrade before an attack was like a silent farewell, a gesture of solidarity in the face of death. The strongest bonds were built in battle itself. When shells fell and orders came to advance, soldiers depended on the man beside them. Comrades dragged the wounded back through mud, risking their own lives to save a friend. In the chaos of no man's land, friendships became shields, giving men courage to stand when fear threatened to overwhelm them. These relationships were forged in blood and fire, and many veterans later said that the loyalty they felt toward their fellow soldiers was unlike anything else in life. One of the most extraordinary moments of humanity came during the Christmas truce of 1914. Along parts of the Western Front, guns fell silent. Soldiers from both sides cautiously climbed out of their trenches, not with rifles, but with open hands. They met in no man's land, exchanged greetings, shared food and tobacco, and even played games of football on the scarred fields. For a brief time, enemies became men again, fathers, sons, brothers, sharing laughter instead of bullets. Though the truce was short-lived and never repeated on the same scale, it became a powerful symbol of the humanity that endured even in the worst of wars. Acts of compassion were not always grand. Sometimes it was a soldier reading a letter aloud to a comrade who could not read, or giving up a dry pair of socks to someone with trench foot. Sometimes it was simply sitting in silence, letting another man know he was not alone. These moments carried immense weight in a world where hope was scarce. The war was brutal, and its violence stripped life of much joy. But within the trenches, men found ways to hold on to their humanity. They created families among strangers, shared laughter in misery, and offered kindness in the face of cruelty. These moments did not erase the horrors, but they gave soldiers the strength to endure them. In the end, brotherhood became the strongest weapon of all. It kept men alive when everything else pushed them toward despair. It proved that even in the deadliest war the world had ever known, humanity could not be completely destroyed. World War I, in the trenches, was not only a struggle of armies, but a test of human endurance against unimaginable hardship. The mud, the disease, the relentless fire, and the terror of no man's land showed the true cost of modern war. Yet in that wasteland of suffering, soldiers found ways to endure through courage, through brotherhood, and through the small sparks of humanity that refused to die out. Their sacrifice carved lessons into history, reminding the world that the price of war is measured not just in victories or losses, but in the lives lived and lost within the walls of those trenches.